Good afternoon and welcome. I hope everyone had a nice morning and a good lunch. Welcome back. My name is Robert Roser and I'm a member of the planning committee for this event, and I want to welcome you. And it's really my great honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Professor John Dunne. I haven't even told you anything about him. He needs no introduction, apparently. Professor Dunne, for those of you who don't know, holds the Distinguished Chair in Contemplative Humanities at the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and his position is also in the newly formed Department of Asian Languages and Cultures there. Professor Dunne's work has focused on a translation and publication on the works of Dharmakirti, and he's also very actively involved with scientists in thinking about the use of Buddhist contemplative practices in modern secular contexts. John was educated at the United States Air Force Academy, at Amherst College, and at Harvard University. And I can say from many years of interaction with him, as many of you know, he has a diamond mind, and I've learned a great deal from him, as I'm sure we will today. So without further ado, I'd like to present Professor John Dunne.
So Rob and I did the elbow bump because I have something is wrong with me. I mean something additional beyond the usual things that are always wrong with me. So I hope you can hear me okay. And I'm going to try to speak fairly softly, which is completely opposed to my nature. So it might make it a kinder, gentler talk. Not that I'm going to channel George Bush or anything. So let me begin by thanking Rob as an old friend. It's wonderful to see a number of old friends and some new friends here. I had the pleasure of spending some time at the European Summer Research Institute of the Mind and Life Europe, and I've already seen a couple of people from that. And it's great to be back in this community. There's Sander, the president, the executive, or whatever he is, of Mind and Life Europe. It's nice to see you, Sander. So it's great to sort of commune with you all. Part of what I'd like to talk about today is something, I hope it's not too dry and boring for you. I'm not going to talk about sort of Buddhist philosophy and practice all that much. I'm really going to talk about the nuts and bolts of my experience of trying to do this kind of work and what has worked and what has not worked. And let me just say that I'll start out with a little bit of background about what I've done and why I thought it might be helpful to do this talk, and then I'll talk about what I mean by transdisciplinarity. There is a whole literature about transdisciplinarity, actually, surprisingly, and it's in a discipline, which is really sort of curriculum studies is one of the places where you find it. And I'm not going to engage with that literature very much. So those of you who know that literature will recognize some echoes of that literature, but I'm going to be kind of taking transdisciplinarity in a slightly different direction. And then I'll talk about some challenges and opportunities. Actually, along the way, I will also talk about a few opportunities, and we'll focus a bit on challenges, and hopefully we'll have time for all that and for some questions. And hopefully my voice will hold up. This just happened last night, so it's interesting karma. So my kind of exposure to this world began around the year 2000. I started as an assistant professor, or actually I started as a visiting assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1999 after I got my PhD. And not long thereafter, one of my students brought me into Richie Davidson's office, and Richie and I started talking and realized we had a lot of connections through people like Alan Wallace, who was my first Tibetan teacher when I was at Amherst. And he asked me to participate in this study. So this is one of the earliest pictures of the ADEPT study that Richie was mentioning last night. And it's great to see them there. And one of the things I really like about this picture is that I wasn't actually there for this picture. But afterward, Richie told me, and I think every time he shows this picture, he says, Matthew just emerged from 3 or 4 hours in the magnet. And he's looking nice and bright and shiny, you know. So that says something itself. And this is, of course, that early adept study when Richie Davidson, Mathieu, but also then especially Antoine Lutz and I began to work together and to collaborate and also to write together. And then in 2005, I was recruited by Emory University, and I went in part to start what we call the Emory Collaborative for Contemplative Studies. And you can see that on the home, this is an old picture of that homepage, a screenshot of that homepage. And who do you see there but Susan Barrow-Wu, who at that time was at Emory. And this was a wonderful experience. We had a great community. But part of the reason I'm speaking to you today is also what emerged from that experience was the failure, actually, of that community. That community, this homepage, I don't think exists anymore. And certainly that collaborative, as far as I know, no longer exists, at least not in the form that it did then. Many of us have left. Most of us have actually left. People like Susan, Chuck Raison, who's now also at Madison, Giuseppe Pagnoni, Larry Barcelou. So many of the sort of core people have left. Wendy Farley as well, the theologian. And it's to see the sort of disintegration of that community is part of is what I'm thinking about is how do you make these communities, how do you sustain them, how do you keep them going, and what do you do in terms of the method, so to speak. That's part of what's motivating all of this. And of course, the other community that I've been involved in, this is an old screenshot as well, from around 2007, which is when I first really started to get involved very seriously with Mind and Life. And this is, on the homepage was a picture of Jimpa and I acting as co-translators, which really meant Jimpa translated and I just nodded my head. But in a meeting in 2007 where Evan Thompson, I think I see him in the back, and I were in Dharamsala on His Holiness's book, The Universe in a Single Atom. And the Mind and Life Institute has been an amazingly successful organization in facilitating the kind of work that we are all doing. And I think there are certain features of the Mind and Life Institute that have promoted that, and I think you will detect them as I speak about what I understand this transdisciplinary study to be. And then finally, now I'm at the Center for Healthy Minds, which I played some part in helping to conceptualize. And the Center for Healthy Minds also now, I think, is being challenged in a way to find, as we bring in many new faculty members, we have a number of endowed chairs to fill. I'm one of them. Chuck Raison is there as well. Larissa Duncan and others will be joining us soon. And how do we're also facing this as an issue. So part of what I'm doing here is also thinking through this for the Center for Healthy Minds. How are we going to engage in this kind of transdisciplinary study? In many ways, the most successful approach is actually where that study is not about an institution, in fact, in ways that I'll try to make clear, but it's about concrete tasks. It's about actually doing something. And this is, I think, for me, one of the most successful enterprises, most successful, you could say, transdisciplinary projects that I engaged in, which was led to the publication last year of this paper in the American Psychologist called Investigating the Phenomenological Matrix of Mindfulness-related Practices from a Neurocognitive Perspective. We thought we should have a longer title, but this short title was... And that's with Amishi Jha, whom you all know from last night, Cliff Sarin, who's going to be keynoting, I think, tomorrow or something, and I see Cliff in the back there. And Antoine, who's not here because he's about to become a father. And this was actually taken in November 2014 in Boston at the 2014 ISCS meeting when we thought, oh, we're done now. And it took us more than an additional year to finish that paper. But this, and as you will see in terms of the way I try to articulate what I mean by transdisciplinary study, it is this, the reason this project in some ways was successful is that it had certain kinds of practices and features that are not really methodological per se. They're about just the mechanics of doing this kind of work on the one hand. And on the other hand, what's very important, and I'm going to say it now and reiterate it again and again, is that there needs to be something that brings together the community of researchers that excites them all and that is very specific, a problem, an issue that they can all deal with, and that they can have a clear kind of signpost for success. Even if it's not an end point, the questions may continue, the research will continue as it always does. But there needs to be a point at which we say, yes, we did it. Right? And that's, I think, that's a very critical element in this kind of work. So now let me say a little bit about transdisciplinarity, what I mean by that, and to do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about disciplinarity. There is a lot of work actually on the idea of what disciplines are. And in my simpleton way, I think of disciplines as being something like a guild structure, not just as a metaphor actually, but in many ways as the Western universities emerged out of a period in which guilds played a very important role in European society. You can think of academic disciplines as operating like guilds, as being descendants in some ways of guilds. And one of the features of a guild structure is that it involves very long-term training, and that long-term training, a large purpose of that long-term training is essentially to locate you within a social community, which is the guild, the social community of that discipline. So it is certainly going to be about more than simply social identity, but it is very importantly about social identity. And a lot of that process actually works in a kind of apprenticeship. And those of you that have been to graduate school or in graduate school will recognize that the process of being a graduate student can very much be like the process of being an apprentice. One is, in a sense, a kind of apprentice. Now, on top of it, and when we think about disciplines, of course, what you're learning, it's not simply becoming a member of a community, not simply being integrated into the intellectual and practical lineage of a particular person in the guild, but it's also learning certain specific techniques and skills that are oriented around the production of knowledge. So the guilds we're talking about here are not, the blacksmith or the potter. Here, what we're producing is not pottery. We're not working with horses. Rather, we're producing knowledge, right? And those skills and techniques are going to be very distinctive across the disciplines. That's part of how disciplines are divided, not just through their social structures and the process of becoming a member of the discipline, but also the techniques and skills. Obviously, many are going to be shared, but disciplines are really defined by the kind of distinctness of the skills and techniques that they use. And then also they have a lingo, right? So I can say to you, I don't know, PFC, and it means no, private first class. But it could mean prefrontal cortex, of course, or VMPFC, right? I can say these things. I don't know where it is. It's in the back, right, Cliff? And then, I can say ACC and dorsolateral ACC, or what I can just say all these things because I hang out with neuroscientists, and I do have some sense of what they mean. But there's a lingo that we can participate in. Now, I can also say to you that, the features of Swasambhiti are such that from the Paramartha perspective, the Grahya Grahaka Bhava structure is not ultimately real. And you go, what? So that's another lingo. That involves Sanskrit, right? And that's a kind of Buddhist studies lingo. So one of the ways in which we are in these disciplines is that we learn a lingo, and it often becomes that apprenticeship process makes it so second nature that we don't even notice when we're with other people. Like I was with a couple of philosophers last night, Evan and a colleague, and we were having dinner together. And there was a time when you could just see them go into philosophy mode, and they just talk to it. It's not even what they say, it's even the sort of body movements and, yes, I'm a philosopher too. Yes, we are philosophers. And it's very interesting, right? So that is what it means to be in a discipline. The other part of it is, of course, that discipline then also has a way of kind of regulating itself, and that's going to be through authority structures that are constituted in what we can call an epistemology, which is basically going to be the way we decide who's right, who's wrong, who's progressing, who's not progressing, what constitutes good evidence, those kinds of questions. And those that epistemology is going to be also something that is inculcated in the individuals, but it is also what regulates the individuals to a very great extent. And finally, there's another important aspect of disciplines is that they have their sort of, spatiotemporal locations, places where they happen, conferences, departments, and these are physically instantiated places that have certain kinds of characteristics, right? And then they also have places where their products are displayed, right? And in our case, for most of the disciplines that you might be a member of, most of those products are going to be print publications, right? So those are going to come out in very specific places. And if one publishes in the wrong kind of place, it actually not only does it not count, it might hurt you, right? So that's what it means. This is something about what disciplinarity is. Okay, that's just a thought, some ideas around disciplinarity. So what do we mean by being transdisciplinary? Because I'd like to suggest that the best kind of work that we're involved in, and part of the reason Mind and Life has been successful, and part of what Mind and Life is actually is a transdisciplinary organization. So what does it mean to be transdisciplinary? Well, I'd like to suggest that it's an emergent, what transdisciplinary involves is a kind of emergent, and I'm going to call it a conversation. And first of all, in terms of emergence, as most of you probably know the basic concepts of emergence. An emergent entity is, and I've learned a lot of this through Evan. It's in some ways very simple, right? An emergent entity is an entity that emerges from the interaction of its components. As a result of that interaction, a kind of system develops, and that system then has one of the characteristics we could say of an emergent system is that it has properties that are not present at the component level. So when we think of a stream of water as exhibiting some features of emergence, we would say that water flows, right? But individual water molecules don't have the properties that they do when they are together flowing as water, right? Individual H2O molecules. A tornado is a great example, actually, also of an emergent entity. Individual air molecules of these various gases can't pick up a car and throw it across the highway, but a tornado can do that because of the way those particles are interacting, the way those gaseous molecules are interacting. So here, what the components are of this emergent system is really the voices of disciplined persons who are located in particular disciplines. They have been trained. They have their own lingo. They have their own research process. They have their publications where they publish, right? They have their epistemology. All of that applies to them. But now persons from different disciplines are going to interact in a conversation which is going to create, and that conversation itself I'm conceptualizing as an emergent event. And what happens sometimes with an emergent system, probably doesn't apply to all emergent systems, but maybe I just think there's some debate about this, but when we have those system-level components, so system-level properties rather, like the capacity of a tornado to throw a car across the road, that those capacities are, part of the way that they emerge is that they constrain the behavior of the components. So that the air molecules, for example, can't simply do whatever they want when they're caught in the emergent system that is the tornado. They have to follow certain patterns of behavior. If behavior is not the right word, they have to follow certain patterns of interaction, right? This is what we mean when we say that there are system-level constraints on the components. So these system-level constraints, when we're in this conversation, there are going to be certain kinds of constraints that I'm going to point to on the participants in the conversation, right? And importantly, those constraints, all of this, rather, this conversation itself, and the constraints that the participants accept willingly are emerging from the need to solve a specific problem with clear criteria for success. So, for example, in the paper that I did with Amishi Jha and Cliff Saran and Antoine Lutz, the specific problem was to ask, what are the varieties of mindfulness? How do we understand, right now, there's so many different definitions, we have no real clarity, we can't even get to the question of mechanism because we don't really even understand what mindfulness is. So that was the sort of question that was driving us. That is what drives the conversation. It's the necessary parameter, so to speak, for the emergence of that system. And that system is very much, for me, like a tornado. The kind of transdisciplinary conversation we're talking about is very much like a tornado. It's very unstable, right? This is not a conversation, and this is what I think is very important, both about the way Mind and Life has worked and the way in which I've been involved in successful transdisciplinary conversations and research projects. I'm involved in a few others right now. When they are successful, there is no assumption that we're going to do that this is long-term, actually. The conversation comes together because of a particular issue, a problem. It may be a problem that has been given to you. It may be an opportunity to write a grant. It may be something that emerges around the dinner table at a restaurant or what have you. And there's a specific problem that drives that conversation. And then the emergent system of that conversation comes into being, and it produces effects. But if one wishes to, if one is trying to create an emergent system that is going to last, in other words, if there's a notion that you can sort of institutionally guarantee that we're going to have this transdisciplinary conversation all the time, I think you will fail. That's my sense of it. You can create the conditions that favor the emergence of these kinds of transdisciplinary conversations, but you cannot make them happen. Right? They are sort of chaotic. They come and they go. I think that's a very important lesson for any of you that are interested in trying to do this kind of work, who are interested in trying to promote this kind of work at your institutions. Now, one of the things that is important in this conversation is there are going to be certain kinds of outcomes. I'll talk a little more about that later. But the other reason that this is not just kind of what is called interdisciplinary work is one of the ways we think about interdisciplinary work is it means that we sort of take different kinds of results and different types of methods and we just kind of stick them together in a row, and then we come up with a concatenated product of some kind. The conception here in the transdisciplinary is that the process of engaging in transdisciplinary research actually changes the disciplined participants in that research. Just as a system-level constraints of an emergent system can change the properties of the components over time, not in all cases, but over time, the properties of the components can be changed. And emergent systems that are ecosystems are good examples of this. So too, the act of engaging in the conversation, in the transdisciplinary conversation, can change the way in which one conceptualizes one's own discipline. Can change the way, even the methods that one deploys in one's discipline. Right? So that's another very important feature that makes this transdisciplinary. But unlike some of the people who have spoken about transdisciplinary work, the way I'm talking about transdisciplinarity here is that it does not constitute a new unified field of knowledge. Right? This is very important. We are not, in the Mind and Life Institute, I do not believe that the consensus among us would be that we are going to sort of create the one grand unified field that's going to give us the final solution. Because we're going to integrate all of these different disciplines and now we're going to get the right answer. That attitude will block this kind of work for reasons I'll explain in a few minutes. Right? So the transdisciplinary conversation is not an attempt to come up with a new discipline, because that's what it would be. Right? So it's not an attempt to come up with a new sort of transdiscipline that's a discipline. Transdisciplinary conversation actually emerges from the impossibility of any single, true, totalizing explanation. Right? Now, I'm not going to make an argument for this, so I'm just going to respect this point. But I think if one holds the stance that my discipline can give us the true account, why would I even engage in a transdisciplinary conversation? Why would I talk to anyone else? Maybe someone gives me a lot of money and I do it for a little while and then I'm done. Right? I'm not taking it seriously. So the prerequisite for this kind of work is the assumption that I do not have the means to come up with the final true account of whatever we're talking about. Mindfulness, meditation, compassion. And indeed, as for reasons that I'll explain shortly, not only do I not have that account, that kind of account is impossible. I cannot ever come up with an account that gives me the true, totalizing, single explanation of any of these phenomena. Right? So that's where, for me, transdisciplinarity really begins, with that kind of humility, actually, as Richie was saying. The humility that recognizes that each discipline is incomplete, but also human knowledge is, by its definition, incomplete. The outcome of the conversation, however, when we talk about the transdisciplinary, is going to be expressed in mostly a disciplined way. It will look a little odd, because, again, that conversation impacts the discipline, right? So it's going to have that conversation is going to impact the way in which the publication or what have you looks, but it's going to be a publication in a recognizable disciplinary journal. So the attempt also, I think, that can be, is really highly problematic would be to create a journal, and I've thought of doing this, and now I'm wondering whether it's really a good idea, is to create a journal that is sort of deliberately transdisciplinary. That may be actually a really bad idea. That turns the transdisciplinary into a new discipline. I'm not so sure that that's a good idea. It seems that the most successful publications, the ones that have the greatest impact, are those that appear in disciplinary fora. And the great thing about that, of course, is you can have one conversation and produce a whole lot of different publications from it. So we've done that one publication, and I've had, depending on how you think about it, either one or two additional publications that I've done on my own that have really emerged out of that conversation that I did with Cliff and so on. Now, in practical terms, how do you make this happen? Basically, you just start talking and you listen. But the process of talking and listening will require that you have a language to talk and listen in. And since it's not going to be a simple conversation, we're going to try to get to some depth. The real challenge here is how do you translate or how do you speak with someone who doesn't know your lingo? So if I say, if I'm having a conversation with Cliff, for example, and I say, well, the Panchasarvatraga really have never included Smriti from the very beginning because Smriti has been later conflated with Samprajanya. And Cliff goes, eh? He does that now and then. And if Cliff throws some neuroscientific lingo back at me, I can parrot it because I'm a very good parrot, but I will have no idea what he's saying. So we have to find a way of communicating. And Larry Barcelow, my colleague, is now at the University of Glasgow, some years ago at a CCARE-sponsored meeting on the problem of terminology that Thupten Jinpa also was very involved in organizing, came up with the idea of the notion of a pidgin. So our pidgin is a language, is a sort of proto-language or a quasi-language that occurs when two different languages meet. And then, over time, they can develop their own grammar. They can develop also their own vocabulary, these pidgin languages, and they become what's called a Creole. So much of our transdisciplinary conversation probably needs to happen at the level of a kind of pidgin. Maybe we'll have a Creole eventually that emerges. I think right now, mostly we're dealing with pidgin languages in our transdisciplinary conversations. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's indeed what we need in order to communicate. If we falsely believe, and I think it would be false if we think that we can simply use our disciplinary lingo in a way that others in other disciplines will fully understand, then we're probably not going to succeed. So being very self-conscious about the construction of that pidgin, of being sure that you're getting communication across the divide of the lingo, of the technical terminology of your discipline, is critically important, I think. Now, in terms of that basic issue that I want to repeat again and again, one of the most important aspects of this conversation is finding a really compelling problem. And you may discover it in conversation, but you may also, it may be given to you because someone asked you to write a grant or someone asked you to write an article as we were asked to write that article. But whatever it must be, the members of this conversation really must be committed to that problem. They must find it compelling. You then also need a reliable context for frequent interactions, and this also is so you can start talking, right? You can start talking. I don't think you can't see my laser. You can start talking in a very informal way, but it's very important to establish regular communications, to really schedule it, to prioritize the conversation, because it will take a lot of conversation. It took us many, many hours to work on that collaborative piece that we did. And that conversation needs to be facilitated. It has to have a very clear kind of context. It has to have a priority. But importantly, it can be remote. And we did a lot of our work through the app called Zoom. And it worked fine. You can do this remotely. You can do this through a remote video app. It's also good to have incentives. I mean, the problem is its own incentive, but some other kind of incentive is very helpful too. Like you have the endpoint of a publication. Writing something together is one of the best sort of practices here. So this is where the institution can play an important role of making the conversation possible, having a space for the conversation, an appropriate space for the conversation, one that sort of invites transdisciplinarity, making the time for the conversation, maybe giving a little money for that conversation, facilitating remote interactions if necessary. So institutions can play a very important role here, but they can't make that conversation happen. The conversation is going to happen, it's going to emerge chaotically, I think. In terms of the team composition, I'm not going to dwell on this. We're running a little low on time, so the team can be, the most important thing about the team is diversity. That's the most important thing. And I missed that. There should be a little tag that says diversity. Diversity, if we're studying contemplative practices, ideally we have a contemplative teacher, not just practitioners. We have a teacher. We have scientists from multiple disciplines, preferably. We also have people who are contemplative scholars. And for me, the difference between a contemplative teacher and a contemplative scholar is a contemplative teacher focuses primarily on the act of teaching the practice. Contemplative scholar is looking at the theoretical underpinnings of the practice. There can be a lot of overlap, and this can even be the same person in some contexts. And I think throwing somebody else into the mix, somebody from left field, an artist, someone in literary studies or what have you, would be a good idea. I've never actually managed to do yet. And then the most important person, I think, in some ways, which is one that, again, this can be a role that is distributed among the participants, is what I would call the reflexivist, which basically is the person who's keeping track of the assumptions and the biases of this conversation. What are we, in what little jar of cherished delusions do we have on our shelf, hidden away, right, that we pretend are not there? That's very important. What are the assumptions of our individual disciplines? So actually including someone like this in a research team, probably an anthropologist, is really critically important. But this doesn't have to be an anthropologist. It can be someone who does cultural history as well. That's another very useful source. Now let me just go through, and have a limited amount of time. Let me just go through, because I want to leave a little time for conversation. Let me point to a couple of challenges here. One of the main challenges is actually hubris, which I know all kinds of things about, let me tell you. But I know everything about hubris. One of the main issues in hubris here, of course, is the hubris of thinking that one can come up with the final account, right? So as you'll see, that's going to be, I'm going to put that under the realm of objectivism, but actually you could say that all of the basic problems that block this conversation come down to different versions of hubris. But the one kind of hubris, One kind of hubris that is particularly important and very dangerous is the idea that you can do it yourself. Like, oh, I can learn enough neuroscience, or I can learn enough Buddhism. I don't need to be a member of. Hear what happened? Oh, there we go. So, and this is the danger, and let me be honest and say that I've certainly, thought at one point or another that I could, learn enough neuroscience to not think that the prefrontal cortex was in the back of my head. But, I'll just use this now. But also I frankly have seen, I'm sorry to say, what I think are many publications that are where persons who have not had an extensive training in Buddhist studies write about Buddhism. And let's just say if you're in Buddhist studies, it doesn't look very good. So, and they get published, actually, in pretty prominent scientific journals, even. So, whoops, I don't mean to be too critical, but I do think this is a big problem. It's very important for us not to think that we don't need the disciplinary training. And all of these disciplines are equally rigorous in their own way, and none of them are easy to understand. Buddhism may seem to be easy, depending on the version of Buddhism. I don't know, Zen. What's Zen? Zen is just like, don't say anything. Sit there. Just sitting. What is that? No, I'm just kidding. But so I teach at Upaya Zen Center quite a lot. But the idea that it's very difficult. There can be rare individuals who can do this. But for most of us, we should not assume that we can do this. This is really critically important, I think. And the other kind of hubris that we can get into, I think, is we can think that our own contemplative experiences, what I've experienced on the cushion, somehow overrides all theory, not even just what scientists might tell us about behavior and so on. That doesn't mean we have to think they're right, but we should take it seriously. If we simply dismiss it because of my own experience on the cushion, that's very problematic. But even worse, if we think my own experiences on the cushion allow me to dismiss all Buddhist theory too, the theory in my own tradition, my own practice tradition, and there's theory even in Zen, despite claims to the contrary, then I'm in big trouble. So the temptation to do it all myself, and also the temptation to, in a sense, allow my meditative expertise to trump all other evidence is a big danger. That's a big challenge. Another big challenge is universalism, the idea that everyone should meditate or everyone should do X practice. Right? This leads to the problem of the randomized control trial, and how one of the reasons we're not seeing effects in meditation studies is that a lot of them are statistically underpowered, as I understand, but also, as this was pointed out by Torko Klingberg in the European SRI this summer, the problem with statistical power in a lot of studies. But also a big problem, of course, is the very notion that everyone should do some practice, and that it's good for everybody. And that's just never been the case traditionally. There's never been a society in which everybody meditated. As far as we know, we have no evidence of that. So this can be a really big obstacle. If this is our starting point, then I think it's a big obstacle. And then scientism is a big obstacle, and what I'm going to call affective Mysterianism is a big obstacle. I don't know if I have time to talk about those. I'll try. Okay, scientism, really, objectivism. Let's do scientism really quick. This was a great study. There's another study on the same topic that's not as good, but this one is good. At least so I'm told by my scientist friends. And what it means is if I show you an fMRI image of anything, you will believe me. So I like this one. This is from the Telegraph. Science, a step closer to tests that can prove you are in love. I don't think I need to say anything about this, do I? But this is true because of the image. You see the images? Okay, I'm not going to belabor that. But this is a big problem. The brain, and I'm kind of a little amused by our, ISCS logo over there because, it's the brain. Anyway. Running out of time. Effective Mysterianism. So Mysterianism is basically a position. It's really a range of positions. And Owen Flanagan, the wild Irishman, is the one who kind of came up with this term, Mysterianism, I believe. And one of the ways in the contemplative world this works out is where we basically think that what we really are. And this is a Western idea, really. This is a Euro-American idea. You do not find this, in my experience, in Asian cultures, certainly not in the Tibetan cultures. But somehow, what makes us really human, well, let me put it this way. We're worried in modernity. Science is showing us that all of our traditional explanations for the world are cosmologies. I mean, even the Dalai Lama is saying we should just throw out Mount Meru, the great axial mountain at the center of the cosmos. Just throw it out. I saw him do that once in a talk. There was a line of monks in the first row, and they all went, whoa. Just throw it out. So, Mount Meru, all kinds of things are falling to scientific rationalism. And even our own bodies becoming the site of scientific rationalist investigation until finally we get to the point where the whole explanation of who we are, and especially our brain, is that it's just this kind of mechanism. What are we? Therefore, we're really just flesh robots, right? We're like cyborgs. This is the governor. We're cyborgs. But we're cyborgs in this who are struggling. So all of this is a wonderful theme in American movies of the cyborg who is struggling to be human, to recall his humanity or to discover a humanity, right? And what is it that makes the cyborg a human again? Or that makes it become a human? It is basically love, emotion. Right? So this is where in the second movie, the governor Terminator terminates himself at an act of love, right? And Data famously, whoops. Sorry. This just disconnected because I'm standing over there. And you might recognize, you Star Trek fans might recognize the cyborg Data. Right? And his struggle is famously to be emotional, and he has trouble being emotional, so look at that. So that's all the places I've been lately, by the way. Yeah, seriously. Way too many. And he has an emotion chip, and he turns it on, and things don't go very well, but... So the idea is that somehow what makes us human is feeling. And this gets very much connected then to religion and spirituality, that religion and spirituality is immune in the end to science because it's not about anything rational. It transcends rationality. It's just about how I feel. It's about my emotions, right? It's our inner core of feeling. I just know it's true. And that position I'm calling effective Mysterianism, right? The danger is that we're just kind of, flesh robots. We're just organic robots. And the solution is to say the essentially human completely transcends the empirical and does so by being rooted in emotion and feeling, not rationality, right? So this actually makes our kind of work impossible, this position. So you can't start, if you have starting from this point, I'm not sure why you would do any empirical research, actually. So, and there's a confusion about this position, which it thinks that in some ways, this position, which I think I've had myself at one point or another, that this position somehow is going to protect me, but actually it is based on the same kind of problem that we can speak about. It is based on the assumption that it's going to give you the one true account. The one true account is that it's all about my emotions and feeling, which I can't even express in words, right? And that's really the same as its enemy, scientific rationalism in the form of objectivism, right? Very briefly, objectivism is the notion that we need to produce a kind of knowledge that is not contaminated by human subjectivity. Right? And we see this as a feature of the scientific method as it develops, but especially kind of takes off as a cultural meme in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And we're going to eliminate the contamination. You know, if a French scientist and an Indian scientist and an American scientist do their work, they're following the same protocol, they should all come up with the same result. And it shouldn't matter that the Indian scientist eats dal every day and the French scientist drinks wine every day, and the American scientist, wears a baseball cap. Those things shouldn't matter. Their individual differences shouldn't matter. So how do we do that? We're basically going to sort of, in a sense, erase human subjectivity from this equation. And using the scientific method, we generate an objectively true model that is not dependent on anything that is unique to me as an individual. And that model is objectively true in that its features correspond directly to real things in the world, independent of human minds. That's what part of this I'm getting from Mark Johnson, by the way. So there are two problems with this. The first problem is a pretty obvious problem, which is map is not territory. A model is not reality. A model is necessarily a model. It picks out features that are of interest for certain purposes. But you cannot, as in the famous story about Jorge Luis Borges, you cannot create a map that is itself the world. Right? Then it's not a map anymore. Now you need a map for the map. So map is not territory. It's critically very simple, but it's so easy to forget. The model is always only a model. It's not what it represents. The second is that models generated in human cognition are contingent on the features of human cognition. Right? So that means they're contingent on our biology, for example, on our cultural conditioning, but also they're highly variable, even across individuals within the same culture. And for these models to be objectively true, the features of human cognition would somehow have to lose their variability, right? Somehow we're going to have the same cognitive structures, or same enough, that they align perfectly with the features of the world, right? Again, this is the way Mark Johnson talks about objectivism, with some of my additions. That somehow, whatever it is about my visual system, for example, whatever it is about my conceptual system, there are elements in my process of research, obviously. My means of doing research involve my senses, my conceptual system, the structures of conceptuality, that somehow all of that must align perfectly with what's really out there, so to speak. Which it seems to me is basically a miracle. That human cognition, which developed to deal with medium-sized things, not really big things, not really small things, but somehow now it can tell us about the whole universe. It has the structures that tell us about the whole universe and the structures that tell about the infinitesimally small, even though it didn't evolve that way. Like that sounds like a religious position to be honest. So that kind of objectivism is actually, exactly in some ways, is just as unfounded as a position that insists that there's this inner untouchable feeling or emotion that makes us human. Both of these are enormous obstacles to research, I would say. Now, I wanted to talk about some opportunities and good old-fashioned intentionality and reflexivity, but I don't have time if I'm going to have questions. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much. So are there any questions? I'm sorry if I disappointed you by doing a dry talk about method and theory, but okay, yes.
Thank you for your really fascinating talk. I'd like to ask two questions which are about, or maybe it's one question about listening as part of the transdisciplinary collaborative process, plus collaboration, plus the question of languages. And it would seem to me, as became clear at last Summer Research Institute in Germany, where we both attended, there was this emphasis on listening, as also is emphasized by Sister Scholastica. And it seems to me that maybe the real, not the real key component, but a very, very important component of any transdisciplinary, well, basically any inquiry, but especially transdisciplinary inquiry, would be a kind of radical willingness to listen rather than talk, and not get the impulse to get the message out in the way of discovering something new, which is by definition something that I don't know yet. So to be comfortable with not knowing and to be radically open to listen. So that's my question. How
that sounds more like a comment, and I love the comment. It's exactly, yes, I didn't have time to talk about that, but it's so important that we have to not knowing is clearly an element in what I'm speaking about here. Sort of letting go of objectivism is in a sense admitting that we never know. That all of the models, that all of our explanations are only that, explanations and models, they're not reality. They can be useful, but they're not reality. And so we, in a sense, never know. If that's what we know, models and explanations, and then we never know. And so that means we're always in a position of learning more, but we only learn by listening. And it's the real challenge, though, is not only do you have to listen, there needs to be a dialogue, an exchange. We have to be sure we're understanding each other. That's hard. It's not always easy. But thank you very much for that.
Hi, similar question. I'm just curious if you know of, could just describe an example of people working from very different assumptions, different epistemological or even sort of ontological viewpoints doing this kind of work in contemplative studies what was their sort of conceptual algebra around we are coming from different frameworks and we're going to make them talk to each other, and this is how we decide what parts of them we will bend on while maintaining their integrity as separate frameworks, if that makes sense.
I think what you're saying is in these conversations, there are going to be points where we hit the limits, and we either limits of understanding or we understand each other, we just disagree. Mm-hmm. I do remember, in those early days when Antoine Lutz was engaged in the adept studies, I did a lot of translating when the monks, various practitioners came through. And one of them was Mingyur Rinpoche, who's gone public about his participation. And we had he was very important actually in terms of the conversations we had with him. But there were definitely times when, Antoine would be listening to Mingyur Rinpoche, and then I'd translate something and Antoine would just roll his eyes like, how could you believe that? And then there were times when Antoine would say something to Mingyur Rinpoche and I'd translate that and he would roll his eyes like, how could you think the mind is the brain? What a silly idea. So, I think that this is why the problem is really important, because most of those issues can be bracketed to solve specific problems.
Okay.
You see? So you don't resolve those issues. They remain, but they are usually irrelevant to the pragmatic problem at hand. So, for example, I want to know whether phenomenal awareness can be enhanced. The capacity of phenomenal, not excess consciousness, but phenomenal consciousness can be enhanced. There could be lots of issues around that which we won't agree on if I'm talking to a scientist and I'm coming from a Buddhist theoretical perspective. But most of those are going to be irrelevant to just trying to understand what we can agree on that phenomenal consciousness or awareness is.
Got it. Thanks.
Yes.
Thanks, John. So my question is about how this not knowing, how are we going to relate that to what I would call a widespread epistemic pretension within Buddhist contemplative practice, but also among a lot of other contemplative practices that contemplation, meditation itself constitutes a special way of knowing that developed to its perhaps asymptotic end constitutes knowing things as they are ultimately in some way. It seems to me that that's there are different, this isn't homogeneous by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's a widespread self-conception embedded in many of these traditions that we meditate, or people meditate to understand and know themselves better, to know the nature of reality more clearly, and in virtue of that knowledge to emancipate themselves from whatever they take their problems to be. So if that's right, then how do we reconcile that particular epistemic pretension with this kind of quasi-skeptical, not knowing kind of attitude that we see from a transdisciplinary perspective?
I guess it would, so certainly one account of what's going on in meditation, even a traditional account, is you're essentially hypnotizing yourself to the truth of your own theoretical system for therapeutic reasons. And that's actually is a pretty good account in Dharmakirti, which looks almost exactly like that. So yeah, I mean, meditation is also a guild training. It's a disciplinary training, and it inculcates in us certain kinds of attitudes. It has its lingo, right? It's all there. I think there are going to be, probably every contemplative tradition has resources, and not just Buddhist, has resources to undermine the claim that, I know, right? And sometimes the way that's undermined is more by an appeal to the virtue of humility, which you would see in Christian contemplative traditions, or a position, let's say Meister Eckhart's position, that Meister Eckhart famously prayed to God to be free of God, in other words, to be free of the notion that he can know God. So I think there are always resources, but that's what you have to do. You have to seek out those resources, and I think if someone is really kind of committed to the absolute truth of their contemplative theory, then they're not a candidate for this kind of work. That's what it comes down to. We have to let go of truth. Except mine, of course, because I'm right.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you.
And then we should stop, because I think we're over by 3 minutes now. So if anyone needs to go and get some tea, please feel free.
Thank you for a thought-provoking talk. I really enjoyed it. My question is quick. You spoke a little bit about team composition. I'm wondering if there is a team size that seems to work better, smaller
that's
or
a
larger.
great question. I will just answer briefly and say I don't know. But my experience is that if you get above 6, it really starts to get unwieldy.
Well, that makes sense.
3 is okay, but I think more than 3 is better.
3 to 6.
So
Great, thank you.
last question, because it's Tawny, go ahead.
He's my professor. Hi, John. It's great to hear from you, and thank you. I thought it was a great talk. One of the issues that I felt like you sidestepped a little bit, but seems to be quite important to transdisciplinary conversations, is cross-discipline training. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the importance of forming the pigeon by learning the other language, and to what degree that cross-disciplinary training needs to be part of the transdisciplinary work.
I think that there are, so one of the ways Larry, who you know, Larry Barcelow, kind of talked about this idea was also the way that some cognitive science programs are structured. And in some of those programs, you try to learn all of this. The CogSci has philosophy, it's got cognitive psychology, it's got linguistics in it, it's got many different subfields. actual disciplines. And sometimes people try to learn all of those, and that doesn't work out very well. In lieu of trying to learn them all, then the other approach is you have a home discipline, but then one kind of learns how to become a good consumer of the other research products, so that you can understand enough to get more than the gist of what's being said, and that facilitates the conversation. And I think it's important for every research team, and I didn't mention this, but it's good that there be someone who's playing that, who's especially good at translating, who's good at making the pigeon, right? And but it's a real dialogical process, because we can think we're understanding each other and we're not, actually. So it needs to be a lot of back and forth. The thing that I really would avoid is the idea that I don't need the conversation, that I can somehow do it myself. I can learn enough of whatever, Buddhism, neuroscience, whatever. I don't need those people. That, I think, is never going to produce the best work. So, on the other hand, it's really good if you can speak the pidgin already. A little bit of training is definitely helpful. All right, everybody, thank you very much. I appreciate it.